When my mother-in-law handed me divorce papers in my own kitchen and said I wasn't good enough for her son, I signed them without a single tear, because something inside me had already died months before. I had no idea that 4 years of erasing myself would lead to inheriting a $140 million empire that employed the man who discarded me. Subscribe now, because this is the story of how being told you're worthless becomes the exact moment you discover your actual value. And I promise the revenge is better than anything you're imagining. I remember the exact weight of that manila folder in Patricia Morrison's hands, as she placed it on my kitchen counter like it was contaminated. The folder made a soft thud against the granite, that expensive Italian granite Nathan had insisted we needed, even though I'd suggested something more affordable. My throat tightened. My chest felt hollow, like someone had scooped out everything vital and left just the shell. The morning light came through the window above the sink, catching dust particles floating in the air, and I caught my reflection in the microwave door. 31 years old, but my eyes looked decades older. Circled with exhaustion, I'd stopped trying to hide with concealer. When did that happen? When did I become this ghost of a person who tiptoed through her own life, trying desperately not to take up too much space? Patricia didn't even take off her Burberry coat, the camel-colored one with the designer buttons, that probably cost more than I'd spent on clothes in the past year. She stood in my kitchen, the kitchen where I'd made her son breakfast every single morning for 4 years, folding bacon exactly how he liked it, crispy but not burned, brewing coffee at exactly the right strength dark, but not bitter, and she looked at me the way you look at something stuck to the bottom of your shoe, that expression. I knew it so well by then. I'd seen it hundreds of times. Disgust mixed with impatience mixed, with that particular brand of upper-class condescension that comes from people who've never had to worry about anything real. Her perfume filled the small space, something expensive and floral with notes of jasmine that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Everything about Patricia cost more than my entire existence. Her handbag, her shoes, her jewelry, her time, all of it calculated and expensive and deliberately displayed. She pulled out the papers and I watched her manicured. Nails tap against the folder. French tips. Always perfect. Never a chip or smudge. I wondered briefly who did her nails, if she went to some exclusive salon where they served champagne and treated her like royalty. My own nails were short and unpolished, practical for housework. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hand stayed steady on the counter, pressed flat against the cool granite. You develop strange instincts when you've been made to feel inadequate long enough. You learn to read the temperature of a room before anyone speaks. You recognize the specific quality of silence that precedes bad news. You can smell disaster coming the way animals sense earthquakes. This silence was arctic. She cleared her throat with that sound she made, the one that always came before criticism, a little performative cough that demanded attention. I'd heard it hundreds of times over 4 years. At dinner parties when I used the wrong fork for the salad course. At Christmas when my gift wasn't thoughtful enough or expensive enough or appropriate enough. At family gatherings when my outfit wasn't quite right. When my hair was too casual. When my laugh was too loud. She told me Nathan had asked her to deliver the papers personally. He thought it would be less awkward this way. Less awkward. The words hung in the air between us. The man I'd married. The man I'd shared a bed with for 4 years. The man I'd rearranged my entire life for. Couldn't even face me to end our marriage. He sent his mother like I was a problem that needed handling. A mess that needed cleaning up. An uncomfortable situation that required a professional touch. She said they wanted to keep things simple and clean. No drama, no complications, no messy emotions. Just sign here, here, and everyone could move on with their lives. Her voice had that practiced patience, like she was explaining basic concepts to a particularly slow child, like she was doing me a favor by being so direct. I felt heat flood my face, a burning sensation that climbed from my neck to my cheeks, then immediately cold, like someone had dumped ice water over my head. My fingers went numb against the counter. Patricia sat down at my own kitchen table without being invited, pulling out the chair that I'd picked out at IKEA 3 years ago. The one Nathan had complained was too cheap looking. She pulled reading glasses from her designer handbag, Hermes probably, and placed them carefully on her nose. She reviewed the papers like she was checking restaurant receipts, her mouth pressed into that thin line of disapproval that had become permanent whenever she looked at me. A line that said I was a constant disappointment, a persistent problem, a regrettable mistake her son had made that she was now correcting. She told me Nathan needed a real partner now, Someone with actual education, not just community college credits. Someone with career prospects, not just housewife aspirations. Someone who could match his professional trajectory, who could stand beside him at corporate events and impress the right people. Someone appropriate. That word hit like a physical blow, like she'd reached across the table and slapped me. Appropriate. I'd heard it so many times over 4 years, it had become my defining characteristic. My scarlet letter. Claire isn't appropriate. This isn't appropriate. We need someone more appropriate. Appropriate meant someone from their world, their tax bracket, their carefully maintained social circle, where everyone had the right degrees, from the right schools, and the right family connections, and said the right things at the right volume, in the right tone. I asked what I would get, and my voice came out smaller than I wanted, thinner, almost childlike. She seemed surprised I was being practical about it, like she'd expected tears and begging and dramatic protests. She said I could keep the Honda in the garage, the 11-year-old Honda Civic with 37,000 miles on it, with the dent in the passenger door from when I'd misjudged a parking space, with the check engine light that had been on for 6 months because I couldn't afford to fix it. Nathan would keep the apartment since it was only in his name. They'd made sure of that when we bought it, his lawyer insisting on the paperwork. His name, his investment, his property. I was just living there, just occupying space that belonged to someone else. She pointed to signature. Lines with her Mont Blanc pen, the one Nathan gave her for her birthday 2 years ago, the one that cost more than I spent on food in 2 months. Something strange happened in my chest right then. I'd spent weeks dreading this moment, lying awake at 3 a.m, imagining myself falling apart completely, sobbing uncontrollably, begging him to reconsider. But instead, I felt this odd calm settle over me like cold water, like I'd stepped into a frozen lake, and the shock had numbed everything. My breathing slowed. My hands stopped shaking. I looked at Patricia across my kitchen table and realized she genuinely believed she was winning. She thought this was victory. She thought she was clearing an obstacle from her son's path to success, removing the embarrassing wife who didn't fit their image. She had absolutely no idea what she'd actually done. She thought she was crushing me, grinding me down into nothing. She didn't realize she was setting me free. I signed those papers with a hand that didn't shake once. My signature came out clean and steady across all 3 pages, loops perfectly formed like I'd practiced. Patricia watched me like she expected tears, expected begging, expected me to fall apart and prove everything she'd always believed about me, that I was weak, that I was nothing without her son, that I was exactly as worthless as she'd spent 4 years implying through 1,000 tiny cuts. But my pen moved smoothly across the paper, and I felt nothing except this strange sense of completion, like I was signing my release papers from prison. She collected the documents with this little satisfied smile, like she'd just completed an unpleasant but necessary task, like taking out garbage, like scheduling a dental cleaning, like any other mundane chore that required minimal effort. She told me Nathan preferred I collect my things during his work hours to avoid awkwardness for both of us. Awkwardness. That word kept coming up, as if the end of a 4-year marriage was just a minor social inconvenience, like canceling lunch plans or forgetting someone's birthday. After she left, I sat at that kitchen table for 2 hours without moving. I watched the light change as morning shifted toward noon. I heard the building settle around me, pipes clanking, footsteps above, muffled conversations through walls. The apartment felt different already, like it knew I didn't belong there anymore, like even the walls were rejecting me. I could hear the couple upstairs arguing about something trivial, their voices rising and falling in familiar patterns. The refrigerator hummed its steady rhythm. A car alarm went off on the street below, blaring for 5 full minutes before someone silenced it. Normal sounds of a normal Thursday morning, while my entire life disassembled itself around me. I thought about the last 4 years in snapshots, like flipping through a photo album of someone else's life. The moment I told Nathan I was dropping out of my nursing program because he needed me home more, because his career was taking off, and he needed support. The look on his face when I suggested going back after he got promoted, that mixture of surprise and irritation like I'd suggested something completely unreasonable. The way he'd introduced me at company dinners as just my wife, like I had no name of my own, no identity beyond my relationship to him, no existence separate from his shadow. I remembered specific moments that should have warned me, red flags I'd deliberately ignored because I wanted so badly to make the marriage work. 3 months into our marriage, Nathan came home irritated because his mother had stopped by unexpectedly and found dishes in the sink. Not dirty dishes piled high, just 2 coffee mugs and a bowl from breakfast. He said I was embarrassing him, that his colleagues' wives kept immaculate homes and somehow managed it without looking exhausted all the time, without making it seem like such a burden. I'd worked an 8-hour shift at the clinic that day, standing on my feet taking patient information and filing insurance forms, and had 2 classes that evening, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that Patricia had seen evidence that I wasn't perfect, that I wasn't living up to the standards expected of a Morrison wife. I started sleeping less after that. The dishes were always done. The apartment was always spotless. Magazines fanned perfectly on the coffee table. Pillows arranged just so on the couch. My exhaustion became something I hid, something I carried privately like a shameful secret. 6 months in, Nathan suggested I dress differently for company events. He said it so casually, like he was commenting on the weather. Nothing too obvious, he said. Just more polished, more professional. More like the other wives who all seemed to shop at the same expensive boutiques and wore the same subtle jewelry. I bought clothes I couldn't afford with a credit card that made my stomach hurt every time I used it, watching the balance climb higher. Dresses that fit the part, shoes that matched, the right handbag, the right coat, the right accessories. I looked appropriate, but I felt like I was wearing a costume, like I was playing dress-up in someone else's life, like I was an actress who'd been given a role, but no script. At those dinners, I learned to smile at the right moments, to nod when the men talked business, to laugh softly at jokes I didn't find funny. I learned that my opinion wasn't wanted, that my presence was decorative, functional, but not actually valued. I was there to look pretty and agreeable, to reflect well on Nathan, to prove he'd made a suitable match. A year in, I stopped mentioning my old dreams entirely. They seemed foolish now, embarrassing, like childhood fantasies I should have outgrown. When someone asked what I did, Nathan answered for me before I could open my mouth, before I could even draw breath to respond. Claire takes care of our home, he'd say with this indulgent smile, like I was a child with a lemonade stand instead of a grown woman who'd given up her career for his convenience. Someone has to do it, right? And everyone would laugh, a polite, knowing laugh that said they all understood the roles we played. I'd laugh too, even though something inside me died a little more each time. Even though I wanted to scream that I'd been 3 semesters from my nursing degree, that I'd had a 4.0 grade, average, that I'd had plans and ambitions and dreams that meant something, that I'd had value beyond folding his shirts exactly the way he liked and hosting his dinner parties, and remembering which of his colleagues preferred scotch versus bourbon. The microaggressions piled up like snowflakes, individually tiny, but collectively suffocating. Each one alone seemed too small to mention, too petty to complain about, but together, they created an avalanche that buried me. Patricia correcting my grammar at family dinners, her voice sweet, but the message cutting. Nathan's colleagues asking what I did all day, implying that housework wasn't real work, that I had it easy while they toiled in offices. His father joking that Nathan had married down, but at least I was pretty. At least there was that compensation for my lack of breeding. Each comment landed like a paper cut, small enough to seem petty if I complained, painful enough to sting every single time. I started measuring my words, carefully before I spoke, started monitoring everything about myself, my clothes, my laugh, my opinions, my volume, my topics of conversation, started making myself smaller and quieter and more invisible, thinking that if I could just be perfect enough, appropriate enough, maybe I'd finally be enough, but I never was. There was always something. My family wasn't connected enough, just working-class people from the suburbs. My education wasn't prestigious enough, just community college, not Harvard. My conversation wasn't sophisticated enough. I didn't know about wine regions or summer homes in the Hamptons. I existed in this constant state of almost, but not quite, forever falling short of a standard that seemed to shift every time I got close to meeting it. The target kept moving. The goalposts kept changing. And the worst part, the part that still made my chest ache with shame, was that I'd started believing them, started thinking maybe they were right, maybe I wasn't good enough, maybe Nathan really did deserve better, maybe I should be grateful he'd married me at all, grateful he'd seen past my obvious deficiencies to give me this life. Now, Sitting in that kitchen with divorce papers signed and my marriage dissolved, I felt something crack open inside me. 4 years of swallowing criticism, 4 years of shrinking myself, 4 years of accepting that my worth was measured by how well I served someone else's life, how seamlessly I fit into someone else's vision. And for what? For this moment, where I was discarded anyway, where all my effort to be good enough meant absolutely nothing. I sold the Honda 3 days later for $7,500 to a used car dealership on the edge of town, one of those places with faded flags strung across the lot and handwritten prices on windshields. The salesman looked at me with something like pity when I accepted his first offer, without negotiating, without even pretending to consider walking away. I didn't care. I needed cash immediately, and haggling felt like something the old Claire would do. The Claire who still had energy to fight over things that didn't matter. The Claire who still believed her efforts could change outcomes. I walked out of that dealership with a cashier's check in my purse, and no way to get anywhere except my own 2 feet. The freedom felt terrifying and exhilarating at the same time, like jumping off a cliff and discovering halfway down that maybe I could fly. I called the community college that same afternoon from a payphone outside a grocery store because I'd canceled my cell phone plan to save money. My hands shook as I dialed, fingers clumsy on the buttons, half expecting them to tell me my credits had expired, that I'd waited too long, that I'd ruined my one chance at something real. The admissions counselor put me on hold for what felt like hours while she pulled up my file. I stood there watching people load groceries into their cars, living their normal lives while mine hung in the balance. She came back on the line and said my credits were still valid, all 36 of them. 18 credits left to complete the nursing technician program. Approximately $6,000 for tuition, books, and fees. My stomach dropped. I did the math right there on that payphone, my brain calculating while she talked about registration deadlines. $7,500 minus $6,000 left $1,500 to survive on until I could find work. No room for error, no safety net, no backup plan, no one to call if things went wrong. I did the math obsessively that night in the cheap motel room I'd rented for $80, sitting on a bedspread that smelled like cigarette smoke and industrial detergent. $1,500. If I could find a room to rent for $300 a month, that left $1,200 for everything else. Food, transportation, basic necessities, emergency expenses, 4 months maximum if nothing went wrong. If I didn't get sick, if no unexpected costs appeared, 4 months to complete 18 credits and pass my certification exam and find a job that would support me. The math was brutal and unforgiving, a tightrope with no net below. One unexpected expense and the whole plan collapsed. One mistake and I'd be homeless. I lay on that scratchy motel bedspread, staring at water stains on the ceiling that looked like maps of countries I'd never visit, and felt terror wash over me in waves. What if I failed? What if I couldn't do it? What if Patricia and Nathan were right, and I really wasn't capable of anything meaningful? What if I'd given up my dreams for nothing, and now discovered I couldn't get them back? But then I remembered Patricia's face when she handed me those papers, the satisfaction in her expression, the smug certainty, the way she'd looked at me like I was a problem finally solved, an inconvenience finally eliminated, the absolute conviction in her eyes that I was nothing and would remain. Nothing. That I'd disappear quietly and never be heard from again. And something hardened inside me, something that felt like ice forming over water, like steel cooling into its final shape. I would prove her wrong or I would die trying. Those were the only options I allowed myself. There was no middle ground, no settling for less, no giving up halfway. I found a room to rent in a house near the college through a handwritten card on a bulletin board at a coffee shop. $350 a month plus $50 for utilities. The room was barely bigger than a closet, with a narrow twin bed that sagged in the middle, and a dresser with a broken drawer that wouldn't close all the way. The wallpaper was peeling in one corner, and there was a suspicious brown stain on the ceiling that the landlord said was from an old water leak that had been fixed. I shared a bathroom with 3 other people, and the kitchen was communal, which meant my food sometimes disappeared from the refrigerator, my milk used in someone else's coffee, my bread taken for someone else's toast. But it was mine. Nobody could tell me I wasn't keeping it clean enough. Nobody could judge how I decorated it. Nobody could criticize my choices or make me feel like I was failing at existing in it. That tiny room with its water-stained ceiling and sagging bed became my sanctuary, my fortress, my evidence that I could survive on my own terms. I registered for classes the next morning, standing in line, at the administration building for 40 minutes. 4 classes, all the credits I could physically handle while working. Medical terminology, anatomy and physiology, patient care basics, and clinical practicum. The program director, a tired-looking woman in her 50s with kind eyes, looked at my schedule and asked if I was sure. She said most students found even 2 classes overwhelming while working. I told her I was very sure. She studied my face for a long moment, really looked at me like she was trying to read my story in my expression. She said she could see I was serious, that she'd had students like me before, students with something to prove, students running from something or toward something, and they either burned out spectacularly in the first month or succeeded beyond everyone's expectations. There wasn't much middle ground. She asked if I had support, family, anyone to help if things got difficult. I told her I had myself, and that would have to be enough. She nodded, slowly, and signed my registration form. I walked 43 minutes each way to campus because bus fare was $3 a day, and that added up to $21 a week. $90 a month I couldn't afford to spend. I timed the route obsessively, finding the fastest path, memorizing every shortcut. My feet developed blisters that turned to calluses within the first week. I learned which streets had better sidewalks, which neighborhoods felt safer, which routes had more streetlights. For the walk home after evening classes, I carried everything I needed for the day in a backpack that made my shoulders ache, loaded with heavy textbooks I couldn't afford to leave at home. I ate peanut butter sandwiches and instant ramen because they were cheap and filling and I could make them last. I studied in the library until it closed at midnight because my room was too small and depressing, and the other tenants were loud at night, playing music and having conversations that echoed through thin walls. The work was hard in ways I hadn't anticipated, not just intellectually, though anatomy and physiology made my brain hurt with the sheer volume of information, but emotionally, physically. I was constantly exhausted, running on 4 or 5 hours of sleep. My body hurt from walking and standing and not sleeping enough. My brain felt overloaded with information, stuffed so full that sometimes I'd forget simple words or lose track of what I was saying mid-sentence. Some nights, I sat on the floor of that tiny room and cried from sheer overwhelming fatigue, from the weight of everything I was carrying. But every time I thought about quitting, every time I considered calling Nathan and begging to come back, I imagined Patricia's face. I imagined her satisfaction at hearing I'd failed. 6 weeks into the program, I found a weekend job cleaning houses through a service that hired workers without extensive background checks or references. $40 per house, usually. 4 to 5 hours of work, depending on the size and how dirty they'd let it get. I could do 3 houses on Saturday and 2 on Sunday if I moved fast, if I didn't take breaks, if I pushed through the exhaustion. $200 a week, $800 a month, enough to breathe slightly easier, enough to sometimes buy real food instead of just ramen and peanut butter, enough to stop waking up at 3 in the morning doing math in my head about whether I could afford toilet paper and laundry. Detergent in the same week. The work was hard and humbling in ways that cut deeper than physical exhaustion. I scrubbed toilets and mopped floors and wiped down surfaces in homes that reminded me painfully of Nathan's apartment. Homes where people had money and space, and lives that looked easy from the outside. Homes with multiple bathrooms and walk-in closets bigger than my entire room. I cleaned around their family photos in expensive frames, their designer furniture, their evidence of comfort and stability and success. And I didn't let myself feel bitter. I couldn't afford bitterness. Instead, I let it fuel me. Every toilet I scrubbed was proof I was willing to work. Every floor I mopped was evidence of my determination. My hands became rough from cleaning chemicals, the skin cracking and bleeding at the knuckles, despite cheap lotion I bought at the dollar store. My knees hurt from kneeling on hard floors, bruised and aching by Sunday night. My back developed a constant dull pain from bending and reaching and carrying supplies. But I was earning money that was entirely mine. Money I controlled. Money that represented hours of my labor that nobody could diminish or dismiss or claim credit for. For the first time in 4 years, I felt competent. I felt capable. I felt like I was building something real, even if it was just the foundation of a foundation, even if no one else could see it yet. 3 months into my program, I started my clinical practicum at a home health care agency on the other side of the city. They placed students with patients who needed basic care, usually elderly people recovering from surgery, or managing chronic conditions, or more often, dying slowly in their own homes. The coordinator warned me that home healthcare was different from hospital work. You saw people at their most vulnerable, in their own spaces, with all their complications and family dynamics and messy reality exposed. You couldn't hide behind clinical professionalism and sterile environments. You had to be adaptable and compassionate and comfortable with discomfort, with death, with the raw edges of human existence. I told her I could handle it. I didn't tell her that I'd become very familiar with discomfort over the past 4 years, that I'd spent years watching myself die slowly in a marriage that suffocated me, that I understood vulnerability intimately. My first patient was Harold Westfield. The agency gave me his file with a warning, their faces serious, like they were sending me into battle. 83 years old, stage 4 pancreatic cancer, extremely difficult temperament. He'd gone through 5 caregivers in 2 months. Most lasted less than a week. One quit after 3 days, another after a single shift. The agency was close to dropping him as a client despite the excellent pay because nobody could tolerate him long enough to provide consistent care. They told me if I could last 1 week, they'd consider it a success and give me an excellent evaluation. If I lasted 2, they'd give me a bonus. The way they talked about him made him sound like a nightmare, a monster, an impossible challenge that would break me. His house was in Beacon Hill, one of those historic brownstones that probably cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. 4 stories of red brick, with black shutters, and a garden that looked professionally maintained, with sculpted hedges and seasonal flowers arranged in precise patterns. The address alone told a story of wealth and status, and a world completely foreign to me. I stood on the front steps that first morning feeling completely out of my depth, my hands shaking slightly as I rang the doorbell. This was a different world. This was Patricia's world, the world I'd never quite fit into despite 4 years of trying. These were the kind of people who'd spent years making me feel inadequate, who'd measured my worth and found me lacking. I almost turned around and left, almost walked away and told the agency I couldn't do it. But I needed the clinical hours desperately, and the agency had made it very clear this was my only placement option. So I rang the doorbell and waited. The house manager, a stern woman in her 60s named Mrs. Chen, let me in without warmth or welcome. She led me through rooms filled with expensive furniture and artwork, up a curved staircase with a polished banister, to a bedroom on the 2nd floor that was bigger than my entire rental house. Harold sat in a leather chair by a tall window overlooking his garden, thin and pale, but with eyes that were absolutely alert, sharp, assessing, intelligent, and unforgiving. He looked at me the way you examine something you're considering purchasing and finding lacking, like I was a product that probably wouldn't meet his standards. He asked if I was the new girl, his voice rough but strong, not the weak whisper I'd expected from someone supposedly dying. I told him my name was Claire Mitchell. He said he didn't care about my name. He cared whether I was competent. Most of the previous caregivers had been useless, he said bluntly. They treated him like he was already dead or stupid or both. They spoke to him in baby voices like he was a child. They tried to control everything and acted like his dignity didn't matter just because his body was failing. They moved his things without asking and made decisions for him and treated him like a problem to be managed rather than a person with preferences and history and rights. I took a breath and told him the truth. I wasn't here to control him or patronize him or treat him like he was incompetent. I was here to help him maintain his quality of life and his dignity for whatever time he had left. His health was failing, but his mind was clearly sharp, and he deserved to be treated accordingly. I would follow his preferences, respect his space, and honor his choices. He stared at me for a long moment, those sharp eyes studying my face like he was reading something written there. Then he nodded slowly. He said that was the first honest thing anyone had said to him in months, maybe longer. Then he proceeded to tell me exactly how he wanted things done, a detailed list of preferences and requirements that I memorized carefully. Coffee at 6 a.m, strong and black, in the blue porcelain cup from the top shelf of the cabinet, never the white ones. He liked the newspaper read to him while he drank it because his eyes got tired. Quickly from the cancer treatment, the words blurring together after a few minutes. He hated when people reorganized his belongings or moved things without asking first. Every item in his room had a specific place, and he knew exactly where everything was. He needed help bathing, but required complete privacy for everything else. No hovering, No checking on him every 5 minutes like he might disappear. He listened to opera in the afternoons, Italian opera specifically, and didn't want conversation during it. The music was sacred time. He had his routines and his preferences, and they mattered to him. Maybe more now than ever because they were the last things he could control. The first week was an adjustment for both of us, a careful dance of boundaries and expectations. Harold tested me constantly. He'd ask for things in deliberately complicated ways to see if I'd get frustrated or confused. He'd criticize small things, the way I folded his newspaper or the temperature of his coffee, to see if I'd take it personally or argue back. He'd swing between politeness and hostility, seemingly at random, to see if I'd maintain consistency or match his mood. I recognized what he was doing because I'd spent 4 years managing Patricia's tests. This was just a different version of the same game, the same underlying question. Prove you're worthy. Prove you can handle it. Prove you deserve to be here. Prove I can trust you not to leave like everyone else. But here was the crucial difference that changed everything. Harold wasn't testing me because he thought I was beneath him. He was testing me because he'd been abandoned by everyone who mattered, and he needed to know if I'd abandon him too. His cruelty came from pain and fear and loneliness, not from genuine contempt or superiority. Once I understood that, once I saw past the harsh exterior to the terrified dying man underneath, everything shifted. I stopped taking his comments personally. I showed up consistently, exactly on time, never late, never with excuses. I learned his preferences and honored them without question or judgment. I treated him like a person instead of a patient, like someone with dignity and history instead of just a body that was failing, and slowly, carefully, like a wild animal deciding whether to trust, he started to let me in. He told me about his life in fragments during those first weeks, pieces of story scattered through our days together. He'd built Westfield Industries from absolutely nothing. Started at 23 with a small manufacturing shop in a rundown building, making basic tools with equipment he'd bought used and repaired himself. He worked 100-hour weeks for years, sleeping on a cot in the back office, eating sandwiches at his workbench. He grew the business slowly, carefully, making strategic decisions about contracts and expansions. Eventually, it became an aerospace components company worth hundreds of millions, employing thousands of people, trading on the stock market. He'd sacrificed everything for that success. Worked 70-hour weeks for 40 years even after he didn't need to. Missed his children's childhoods because he was always at the office or traveling for business. Sacrificed his marriage because his wife wanted a partner and got an absence instead. Built an empire but destroyed his family in the process. And now he was dying alone in a house full of expensive things, with children who called once a month to ask about inheritance and estate planning, but never about his pain or his fears. Grandchildren he'd never met because his children kept them away, not wanting to expose them to a dying old man. The nurses and caregivers came and went like shifts at a factory. His family sent expensive flower arrangements with generic cards signed by assistants. I was the only person who spent real time with him, who saw him as something more than a burden or a bank account. We developed a routine over those weeks that became its own kind of intimacy. I'd arrive at 6 with his coffee, letting myself in with the key Mrs. Chen had given me. We'd read the paper together, me summarizing articles and reading sections that interested him. I'd help him with morning care, bathing and dressing, always preserving his dignity and privacy. We'd have breakfast, usually oatmeal with berries and honey that I learned to prepare exactly how he liked it, not too thick, not too sweet. Then I'd help him move to his chair by the window where he could see his garden and watch the seasons change. Afternoons were for opera, Puccini and Verdi filling the room while he closed his eyes and conducted with slight movements of his fingers. Evenings I'd read to him, usually biographies of historical figures he admired. Churchill, Roosevelt, industrialists who'd built empires like he had. The work itself wasn't technically difficult, but the emotional labor was profound. I was caring for someone at the end of life, watching him grapple with mortality and regret, and the weight of choices that couldn't be unmade. Harold asked me questions too, turning the tables during quiet moments. Where I came from, why I was in nursing school, what my story was. I deflected at first, keeping professional boundaries the way I'd been taught, not wanting to burden him with my problems. But one afternoon, while helping him back to bed after a difficult morning where the pain had been particularly bad, he asked directly why someone my age was doing clinical work instead of already established in a career, why I looked so tired all the time, why I walked to his house instead of driving. why my hands were rough and cracked from chemicals, and something about his directness, his refusal to accept anything but honesty, his way of looking at me like he could see through pretense to truth, made me tell him everything. I told him about Nathan, and the marriage that slowly suffocated me, about dropping out of school because I was told I needed to be available, needed to be appropriate, needed to fit into a life that had no actual space for me as a real person, about the 4 years of disappearing piece by piece until I barely recognized myself in mirrors, about Patricia handing me divorce papers in my own kitchen and telling me I wasn't good enough for her son, wasn't good enough for their world, about selling my car for $7,500 and living in a room the size of his closet, about walking miles every day because I couldn't afford bus fare, about eating ramen and cleaning houses on weekends and studying until my eyes burned and my brain felt like it would explode, about being 31 and starting over with nothing except determination and spite. Harold listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. He usually had opinions about everything, commentary on every topic, but this time he just listened, his sharp eyes fixed on my face while I talked. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. I thought maybe I'd said too much, crossed some professional boundary that couldn't be uncrossed. But then he spoke, and his voice was gentler than I'd ever heard it. He said I was stronger than I knew, that most people who get knocked down that hard stay down, accept the story written about them, believe the lies they're told about their worth, that choosing to get back up, to fight for something better, to refuse to accept the narrative other people created, that took rare courage. He said his biggest regret in life was building an empire while forgetting to build relationships, that he'd prioritized the wrong things and now faced the consequences. He had money and success, and a name people recognized, but he was dying alone without anyone who truly cared. But I was doing the opposite. I was building myself back from nothing, and that foundation, that core of self-worth and determination, was worth more than any fortune. His words cracked something open inside me that I'd been keeping carefully sealed. I'd spent so long believing I was worthless, believing Patricia and Nathan were right about me, that hearing someone see actual value in my struggle felt revolutionary. It felt like permission to believe in myself again. Harold became more than a patient after that conversation. He became something like a friend, though that word felt inadequate for what our relationship actually was. He was a mentor, a confidant, someone who'd lived long enough to see through pretense to truth, someone who'd made his own mistakes and could recognize strength when he saw it. And I became more than his caregiver. I became someone who genuinely cared whether he was comfortable, whether he was in pain, whether his last months had any moments of joy or connection in them. We talked about everything during those afternoons when the opera wasn't playing. Harold told me about building Westfield Industries, about the specific decisions that grew the company and the mistakes that cost him his family. He told me about his ex-wife, Margaret, who remarried a French professor and moved to Paris, who sent him a Christmas card every year with a polite update, but nothing personal. About his son, Stephen, who only contacted him through lawyers now. All communication filtered through legal language about estate planning and succession. About his daughter, Margaret, named after her mother, who lived 20 minutes away, but might as well have been on another planet for how often she visited. About grandchildren he'd never met, whose names he knew only from social media posts he looked at late at night when he couldn't sleep. He told me about the loneliness of success, about having everything money could buy, and nothing that actually mattered. His stories were cautionary tales wrapped in regret, warnings from someone who'd learned the lessons too late to apply them. I told him about my dreams before Nathan, back when I thought I could be a nurse and help people and build a meaningful career that mattered. Harold asked why I'd given that up so easily. I tried to explain about wanting to be a good wife, about believing marriage meant sacrifice, about thinking if I could just be perfect enough I'd finally be valued and loved properly. He looked at me with something like pity and said that wasn't marriage, that was erasure. That real partnership elevates both people, doesn't require one person to disappear so the other can shine brighter. His clarity was painful, because it confirmed what I'd known deep down all along, but had been too scared to acknowledge. My marriage had never been a partnership. It had been a slow-motion disappearing act, where I was both the magician making myself vanish and the victim watching it happen. Harold's health declined steadily over those months, despite the treatments, despite the expensive medications, despite everything money could buy. Some days were better than others, days where he had energy and appetite and could sit by the window for hours, But the trajectory was clear and inevitable. He needed more help with basic tasks. Bathing became harder. Getting dressed took longer. He slept more, sometimes 15 or 16 hours a day. He ate less, just a few bites before pushing food away. The pain increased, despite stronger medications, morphine derivatives that made him foggy, but didn't fully eliminate the hurt. But his mind stayed sharp on the good days. He wanted to talk about legacy, about what he'd leave behind, about whether any of it ultimately mattered. He said his company would continue after he died, making profits for shareholders, employing people who'd never know his name or care about his story. His children would inherit money they didn't need and wouldn't appreciate. His grandchildren would grow up hearing stories about him if they heard anything at all, just abstract tales of a grandfather they'd never met. What was the point of all of it? All the years of work, all the sacrifices, all the success? What did it amount to in the end? I didn't have good answers because there weren't good answers to questions like that. But I told him honestly that he'd impacted me profoundly, that his kindness and honesty and willingness to see my worth when I couldn't see it myself had helped me believe I could survive, could rebuild, could become someone again. That maybe legacy wasn't about buildings and bank accounts and companies listed on stock exchanges, but about moments of genuine, human connection, about the lives you touched personally, about the people you saw and valued. He smiled at that, this small, sad smile, and said I was young and idealistic, but maybe not completely wrong. He said most people pass through his life without really seeing him, just seeing his money and his status and his power, just seeing what he could do for them, or give them. But I'd seen him as a person, as someone with fears and regrets and humanity. That was rare and valuable, and he was grateful for it. One afternoon in late October, while I was reading to him from a biography of Henry Ford, Harold interrupted me mid-sentence. His voice was serious, weighted with meaning that made me look up from the book. He said he needed to discuss something important with me, something he'd been thinking about carefully for weeks. My stomach clenched with anxiety. I thought maybe he was going to tell me the doctors had given him a timeline, that we had days instead of weeks, or that he was firing me, that I'd done something wrong despite thinking everything was going well. He said he'd been working with his attorney on updating his will, that he'd been thinking carefully about legacy and what actually mattered, about who deserved to inherit what he'd built, that he wanted to take care of the one person who'd actually taken care of him. My stomach clenched tighter. I told him quickly that he didn't owe me anything beyond my salary, that taking care of him was my job and my choice, that I didn't expect anything more. He waved his hand dismissively, irritated by my protest. He said this wasn't about owing. This was about recognizing value and making sure the right person inherited what he'd built, making sure his legacy went to someone who would honor it properly, who would see the employees as people rather than numbers on spreadsheets. He said his children would receive fair amounts, $2 million each, enough to be comfortable but not enough to waste on frivolous things or destroy their lives with too much unearned wealth. They'd complain, but they didn't deserve more. They'd proven over decades that they didn't value him or what he'd created. The rest, the majority of his estate, including controlling interest in Westfield Industries, was going to me. He said it matter-of-factly, like he was discussing the weather or what to have for lunch. 51% of the company, the house in Beacon Hill, investment portfolios, approximately $140 million total. I couldn't process what Harold was saying. The words made sense individually, but together they created a sentence my brain refused to accept. Controlling interest in Westfield Industries, $140 million, going to me. I told him he couldn't do that it was too much, that his children would destroy me legally. I was just a nursing student cleaning houses on weekends. I had no business owning a company worth hundreds of millions. Harold made a sound that might have been a laugh if he'd had more breath. He said his children had proven repeatedly they didn't value what he'd built. They valued the money, sure, but not the company itself, not the people who worked there, not the legacy of what he'd created over 40 years. Stephen wanted to cash out and retire early to some beach somewhere. Margaret wanted to sell her shares immediately and invest in some tech startup her husband was involved with. Neither of them understood or cared about the actual business, about the 12,000 people whose livelihoods depended on it. He said I'd shown him more genuine care and respect in 6 months than they'd shown in 40 years combined, that I understood the value of treating people with dignity, of seeing humans as humans rather than resources to exploit. that the company needed someone who wouldn't gut it for short-term profit, who would think about employees and sustainability and building something lasting, that I was young enough to, guided into the future but compassionate enough to do it ethically. I tried to protest again, but he held up his hand, the gesture weak but definitive. He said he'd made his decision, and it was final. His attorney, Martin Hendricks, had prepared everything meticulously. He'd undergone psychiatric evaluation by 3 separate doctors to prove he was of completely sound mind. The will was ironclad, reviewed by multiple law firms, and there was nothing his children could do to contest it. Successfully. My mind spun in 1,000 directions at once, trying to grasp the implications. Westfield Industries. I'd looked up the company after Harold first told me about it, curious about what he'd built. Annual revenue of $307 million. 12,000 employees across 6 facilities in 3 states. Publicly traded with a market cap around $2 billion. And Harold was telling me he was leaving me controlling interest, 51% of the shares. That meant not just money, though the financial implications were staggering enough to make me dizzy. That meant actual control, power, the ability to make decisions that affected thousands of lives and families. The responsibility was terrifying, but there was something else too, something I barely let myself think about in that moment, a thought that flickered at the edges of my consciousness. Westfield Industries had 3 major subsidiaries. One of them was Horizon Tech Solutions, where Nathan worked, where he was a regional director with his corner office and his expense account and his company car and his absolute certainty that he was more important, more valuable, more worthy than I could ever be. Harold knew this. He'd told me weeks ago that he'd had me investigated before changing his will. Not because he didn't trust me, he'd been clear about that, but because he was being legally cautious. His attorney had compiled a complete background report. They knew about Nathan. They knew about the divorce. They knew about Patricia and her manila folder and her Mont Blanc pen. Harold had looked at me with these knowing eyes that saw everything and said he found the connection poetically appropriate, justice working itself out through unexpected channels. I asked him directly if that was why he was doing this, some kind of revenge on my behalf, a way to punish Nathan for how he'd treated me. Harold shook his head slowly, the movement careful because it made him dizzy. He said revenge was a bonus, but not the reason. A pleasant side effect, but not the motivation. The reason was that I'd proven myself to be exactly what his company needed. Someone with empathy and integrity and the ability to see people as people, not resources or obstacles or tools. Someone who could be trusted with power because I understood intimately what it felt like to be powerless. Someone who would use wealth to build rather than just consume. Someone who treated a dying old man with dignity when she had nothing to gain from it. The fact that it would also allow me to hold Nathan accountable for how he'd treated me, that I would have power over the man who'd discarded me like trash, was simply justice working itself out. Karma catching up. The universe correcting an imbalance. 3 weeks later, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in November, Harold died. I was sitting beside his bed holding his hand, playing Tosca on the CD player like he'd requested that morning. His breathing had been labored. All day, each breath a struggle, a rattling sound that scared me. Then suddenly around 3 o'clock it got quieter, easier, like he'd stopped fighting and accepted what was coming. He opened his eyes one last time and looked directly at me, really looked at me with complete clarity and recognition. His lips moved and I leaned closer to hear, my ear near his mouth. "Thank you for seeing me." Those were his last words, barely a whisper. "Thank you for seeing me." Then his hand went slack in mine, the warmth slowly fading, and he was gone. I sat there for a long time, still holding his hand as it cooled, as the life drained out of it and left just flesh and bone. The opera played on, Tosca's final aria filling the room with tragedy and beauty. Rain drummed against the windows in steady rhythm. The garden outside looked gray and blurred through the water streaming down the glass. I cried, not the dramatic sobbing I'd expected, but quiet tears that felt like grief and gratitude mixed together, in equal measure. Harold had changed my entire life. He'd shown me kindness when I'd forgotten what that felt like. He'd valued me when I'd stopped valuing myself. He'd given me back my sense of worth and capability and purpose. And now he was gone, and I was holding his hand in an empty house, the last person on earth who genuinely loved him, not for his money or his status or what he could provide, but for who he actually was underneath all that. The funeral was small, held on a cold morning. At a cemetery in Cambridge, Stephen and Margaret showed up looking appropriately somber in expensive black clothing. Designer grief. They barely glanced at me when Harold's attorney, Martin Hendricks, introduced me as his primary caregiver. I was just hired help in their minds. Invisible. Irrelevant. The person who'd gotten paid to wipe their father's body and listen to his complaints. They had no idea what was coming. They stood by his grave looking bored and checking their watches, waiting for this inconvenience to be over, so they could get on with dividing their inheritance. I heard Stephen telling someone on the phone that he had meetings that afternoon, that he couldn't be away from the office too long. Margaret spent half the service on her phone, probably texting. I stood apart from them, genuinely mourning, and watched them perform grief they didn't feel. The will reading was scheduled for the following week at Martin's downtown office in a building with marble floors and mahogany paneling. Stephen and Margaret arrived together, confident and impatient, talking about restaurants and vacation plans. They'd probably already spent the money in their minds, probably already had plans for how they'd liquidate assets and cash out, probably arguing about who deserved more. Martin was a serious man in his 60s who'd worked with Harold for 30 years. He looked at Stephen and Margaret with thinly veiled disapproval. He looked at me with something like respect. Then he opened the will and began to read in his measured legal voice that was about to detonate their entire world. He read through the preliminary items first, his voice steady and professional. Small bequests to longtime household staff, $10,000 to Mrs. Chen, who'd managed the house for 20 years, $5,000 to the gardener, a donation of $50,000 to the Boston Symphony Orchestra that Harold had loved. Then he got to the substantial assets, and I watched their faces carefully. To Stephen Westfield, I leave $2 million and the property in Cape Cod. To Margaret Westfield, I leave $2 million and my complete art collection. I saw them exchange quick glances, clearly expecting more but assuming the bulk would come next. $4 million was nothing to them. Pocket change compared to what they thought they deserved. Stephen actually looked annoyed, like the amount was insulting. Margaret's mouth was pressed into a thin line of displeasure. Then Martin continued, and I watched their world implode in slow motion, every syllable a bomb. The remainder of my estate, including 51% of Westfield Industries stock, my primary residence at 47 Beacon Hill, all associated investment portfolios, and liquid assets totaling approximately $140 million, I leave to Claire Mitchell. Martin paused deliberately, letting that sink in, letting them process. She demonstrated more genuine care and human decency in 6 months than I received from my own children in 40 years. She treated me with dignity when I was dying, and everyone else treated me like I was already gone. She has earned this inheritance through compassion, not blood relation, and I trust her to honor my legacy better than those who share my DNA. The silence in that office was absolute, complete, like all the air had been sucked out of the room and we were all in a vacuum. Margaret's face went white, then red, then purple. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out for several seconds. Stephen stood up so fast his chair fell backward, clattering against the floor. He started shouting immediately, his voice rising with each word. This was fraud. This was manipulation. I'd taken advantage of a sick old man. I'd isolated him from his family and poisoned him against them. He'd sue. He'd contest the will. He'd prove his father wasn't in his right mind. The attorney would lose his license for allowing this travesty. He'd make sure I never saw a penny of it. Martin remained completely calm, like he'd been expecting exactly this reaction. He pulled out a thick file from his desk drawer and placed it on the table with a heavy thud. He said Harold had anticipated their reaction quite specifically. That's why he'd undergone extensive psychiatric evaluation by 3 separate doctors, all of whom had declared him to be of completely sound mind right up until his death. That's why he'd documented his reasoning in detailed letters written over several months. That's why he'd made multiple video recordings explaining his decision and his feelings about his children. That's why he'd consulted with 5 different law firms to ensure the will was absolutely unbreakable, ironclad, bulletproof. Stephen and Margaret could contest if they wanted, Martin said evenly. They were certainly within their rights, but they'd lose and waste money on legal fees in the process. And the will included a clause that anyone who contested unsuccessfully would forfeit even the $2 million they'd been left. Margaret finally found her voice, and it came out shrill and sharp. She turned to me with pure hatred burning in her eyes, hatred so intense I could feel it like heat. She called me a gold digger, a manipulator, a predator who'd targeted a vulnerable elderly man. She said I'd probably withheld medication to make him suffer, probably poisoned him emotionally against his own children with lies and manipulation. She said I was disgusting and pathetic, and she'd make sure everyone knew what kind of person I really was. She'd destroy my reputation. She'd make sure I never had a moment of peace. Her voice was shrill, and her face was twisted with rage, and spittle formed at the corners of her mouth. I waited until she ran completely out of breath, until she stood there panting. Then I spoke for the first time since entering that office, my voice steady and calm. I said I was sorry she felt that way, but Harold made his own choices based on how his children had treated him for decades. Not months, not years. Decades of neglect and indifference and treating him like an ATM instead of a father. I hadn't poisoned him against them. They'd done that themselves through years of missed visits and phone calls filtered through assistants and treating his dying as an inconvenience in their schedules. I said I'd spent 6 months caring for him, while they couldn't be bothered to visit more than twice. Twice in 6 months to see their dying father. I'd held his hand while he cried about dying alone. I'd listened to his regrets about prioritizing work over family. I'd been present for him when no one else was, when everyone else was too busy or too uncomfortable or too focused on their own lives to care about his suffering. Stephen tried a different approach, sitting back down and forcing his voice to sound reasonable. He said we could work something out, split the inheritance more fairly. He and Margaret would accept 20% of the company each, if I took the rest. Or we could sell the whole company and divide the proceeds. We could all walk away satisfied, he said, like this was a business negotiation. No hard feelings. I looked at him with this cold clarity I'd never felt before, a certainty that came from somewhere deep. I said no. Harold made his decision knowing exactly what he was doing. He was evaluated by 3 doctors. He wrote letters explaining his reasoning. He made videos. He thought about this carefully, for months. I wasn't negotiating away what he'd given me just to make them comfortable. He'd chosen me for specific reasons, and I intended to honor that choice. Martin handed me a separate envelope, cream-colored heavy paper with my name written in Harold's shaky handwriting. He said Harold had written me a personal letter to be read after the will. I opened it with shaking hands while Stephen and Margaret watched. Harold's handwriting was barely legible, each letter an effort. "Claire," he wrote, "by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Thank you again for everything you gave me in those final months. The inheritance isn't charity or payment. It's recognition of your worth and your character. You proved yourself to be exactly the kind of person who should have power and resources. Someone who treats people with dignity even when you have nothing to gain from it. Use what I've given you wisely. Build something meaningful. Treat the employees well. And remember what I told you. Character isn't revealed in success, but in how you treat people who can't offer you anything. You have character. My children never did. Make me proud." I folded the letter carefully and put it in my purse. I stood up and looked at Stephen and Margaret. They looked smaller somehow, diminished, all their confidence and arrogance stripped away, leaving just 2 angry middle-aged people who'd miscalculated badly. I told them their father loved them, but they'd never valued that love. They'd shown him exactly who they were when they thought it didn't matter, when they thought he had no choice but to leave them everything. I was simply the person who'd bothered to see him as human, instead of just a source of wealth. Then I walked out of that office with Martin following, to discuss next steps and logistics. Behind me I heard Margaret start to cry. Not tears of grief for her father, tears of rage at losing money she'd already spent in her imagination. 2 days later, I attended my first board meeting at Westfield Industries as the majority shareholder. I wore a suit I'd bought at a consignment shop, navy blue and simple but professional. 23 executives sat around a massive conference table in a room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. All of them older than me. All of them men except 2 women tucked at the far end. All of them clearly skeptical about the young woman who'd somehow inherited control of their company. I could see it in their faces. The doubt, the dismissiveness, the assumption that I'd be easy to manage or manipulate. The interim CEO, a man named Robert Chen, started to explain how things worked, his tone patronizing like he was explaining to a child. He said they'd prepared a presentation about company operations for me. I let him talk for about 30 seconds. Then I interrupted and said I understood exactly how things worked, and we'd be making some significant changes starting immediately. I'd spent the past 2 days reading every financial report and operational document Martin had provided. I understood the business structure, the profit margins, the subsidiary relationships. His face went red, but he shut up. Power, I was learning, had a very specific sound. It sounded like not having to explain yourself. It sounded like people listening when you spoke instead of talking over you. The first change I made was requesting a full operational review of all 3 subsidiaries. I wanted to understand how each company functioned, who the key personnel were, what the culture looked like, where improvements could be made. I wanted employee satisfaction data, retention rates, HR complaints, everything. The executive team seemed surprised that I was actually planning to be involved, rather than just collecting dividends and letting them run things. I made it very clear that wasn't how this was going to work. Harold had trusted me with his legacy, and I intended to honor that trust by actually leading, not just existing as a figurehead who signed papers they put in front of me. Horizon Tech Solutions came up in the 3rd week. The subsidiary CEO, a nervous man named David Park, presented their quarterly reports. I saw Nathan's name listed as Regional Director, Boston Territory. My heart rate increased, but my face stayed perfectly calm. I asked specific questions about their management structure, their employee satisfaction scores, their retention rates. The numbers told an interesting story. Turnover in Nathan's region was 47% higher than other regions. Multiple HR complaints had been filed and quietly settled with NDAs and small payouts. A pattern of favoritism and poor leadership that everyone seemed to tolerate because his sales numbers were adequate, not exceptional, just adequate. I thanked David for his presentation and said I'd be scheduling individual meetings with regional directors to better understand operations. Nathan's meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon 2 weeks later. I had my assistant send the calendar invitation without explanation, just a meeting request with the new majority shareholder. I wondered if he'd recognize my name, Claire Mitchell instead of Claire Morrison. Maybe he'd assume it was coincidence. Maybe he'd convince himself it couldn't possibly be me. I sat in my office on the 42nd floor with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor and waited to see his face when he walked in. The office had been Harold's before he got too sick to come in. Now it was mine. Mahogany desk, leather chairs, original artwork on the walls, a view that cost more than most people's houses. He arrived exactly on time, wearing an expensive suit, carrying a leather portfolio. He knocked and I told him to come in without looking up. I was reviewing documents when he entered, so I let him stand there for a moment, uncertain, the power dynamic already shifting. Then I raised my eyes slowly and watched his face cycle through confusion, recognition, disbelief, and pure shock in rapid succession. His mouth actually fell open. He dropped his portfolio, and it hit the floor with a thud. He said my name like it was a question, like he wasn't sure his eyes were working properly. Claire? I smiled, the same polite professional smile I'd perfected at his business dinners, where I'd been decorative and silent. Hello, Nathan. Please sit down. He sat, but he looked like he might pass out. His hands gripped the arms of the chair. His face had gone pale. He asked how this was possible, his voice barely above a whisper. I gave him the abbreviated version, keeping my tone neutral and professional. Got divorced, finished my degree, worked in home health care, cared for Harold Westfield, inherited his estate including this company. Each sentence landed like a blow. His face went through several more expressions as he tried to process. I could see him calculating frantically, trying to understand what this meant for him, for his job, for his future. I let him work through it for a moment. Then I told him I'd been reviewing his performance metrics across all regions, and they were concerning. High turnover suggested poor management and toxic culture. HR complaints suggested hostile work environment and potential liability. His sales numbers were adequate, but not exceptional, certainly not enough to justify the problems in his region. We needed to discuss his future with the company. I kept my voice calm and professional, like I was discussing weather patterns instead of dismantling his career. Nathan tried to recover, launching into explanations. The turnover was just bad luck, wrong hires, people who weren't good fits. The HR complaints were misunderstandings, oversensitive employees who couldn't handle direct feedback. His team was actually very strong, he insisted. The numbers would improve next quarter. I listened without interrupting, the way I'd listened to him for 4 years while he talked over me and explained things I already understood. When he finished, I said we were restructuring his position effective immediately. He'd remain with the company, but as a regional supervisor rather than director. 40% salary reduction. No executive benefits. No company car. No expense account. No corner office. Take it or find other employment. Those were his options. His face flushed red. He said this was personal retaliation, that I was abusing my power, that he'd sue for wrongful demotion and discrimination. I stayed perfectly calm, leaning back in my chair. I said this was a business decision based on objective performance data reviewed by our legal team. If he chose to view it as personal, that said more about his conscience than my motivations. If he wanted to sue, he was welcome to try. But my legal team was excellent, and his case was non-existent. The HR complaints alone justified termination. I was being generous by offering him any position at all he could accept. The new role, or resign, those were his only options. I gave him 24 hours to decide. He sat there for a long moment, breathing hard, his face cycling through anger and humiliation. Then he said quietly that he'd take the position, because he needed the job. Because at 41 with a mediocre track record and HR complaints in his file, he didn't have better options. Because the market was competitive and he had a mortgage. Because the power dynamic had completely reversed and we both knew it. I told him that would be all, and dismissed him with a nod. He left looking smaller than when he'd arrived, shoulders hunched, confidence shattered. I felt no triumph, no vindictive satisfaction, just this cold clarity that justice had worked itself out naturally. Nathan had shown me exactly who he was when he thought I was powerless. Now he was experiencing what powerlessness felt like. Patricia tried to contact me twice after Nathan told her what happened. Long emails about misunderstandings and family, and couldn't we find a way to reconcile? She said she'd always seen potential in me, that she'd been trying to help me improve, that families should stick together. The revisionist history was almost impressive. I blocked her address after the second email. She'd made it very clear I wasn't good enough for her world when she thought it mattered. Now that I owned a significant piece of that world, she suddenly wanted connection, but I didn't need her validation anymore. I didn't need her approval or her acceptance. She'd shown me who she was in my kitchen that morning, with her manila folder and her Mont Blanc pen. I simply believed her. 6 months into running Westfield Industries, I established a foundation using company profits. Scholarships for adults returning to education after life interruptions, especially women, especially people who'd been convinced to give up their dreams for someone else's convenience, especially those who'd been told they weren't good enough, weren't smart enough, weren't worthy enough. The applications broke my heart because I recognized myself in so many of them. People who'd erased themselves trying to be what others wanted, people who were fighting to become visible again. I funded as many as I could, hundreds of scholarships. Each one felt like giving my younger self a chance. My office on the 42nd floor had Harold's photo on the credenza. Next to it, I kept the last letter he wrote me in a silver sal frame. Character isn't revealed in success, but in how you treat people who can't offer you anything. You have character. They never did. I looked at those words every day and remembered who I'd been in that tiny rental room eating ramen and wondering if I'd survive. I remembered walking miles to save bus fare, my feet covered in blisters. I remembered cleaning toilets in houses that looked like the life I'd lost. I remembered feeling worthless and invisible and completely defeated. I remembered signing those divorce papers with Patricia watching, waiting for me to break. And then I looked out at Boston Harbor and the city stretching beneath me, and I remembered something else. I remembered that being discarded wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning. Patricia had been right about one thing. Just one thing in all her judgment and condescension. Nathan deserved someone better. She just didn't realize that someone was me, and he'd lost me the moment he decided I was worth nothing. Now I was worth $140 million and controlled the company that employed him. But more importantly, more meaningfully, I'd proven to myself that my value was never dependent on anyone else's assessment, that my worth existed independent of their recognition. I grabbed my phone and did something I hadn't done in months. I recorded a quick video sitting at my desk with Boston behind me, the harbor sparkling in afternoon light. I talked about my story without shame or apology, about Harold and second chances and self-worth, about refusing to accept other people's limitations. I ended it with a simple message. If someone treats you like you're worthless, believe them. Believe they're showing you exactly who they are. Then prove to yourself that they were wrong. Not to them. They don't deserve that satisfaction. To yourself. That's the only opinion that actually matters. I posted it and asked people to share their own stories of starting over. Within hours, the comments, filled with thousands of people who'd been where I was, who'd been told they weren't enough, who'd had to rebuild from nothing, who'd discovered their own worth after someone else had tried to destroy it. I read through them, feeling this enormous sense of connection. We were all just people trying to find our way back to ourselves after someone else had convinced us we were lost. Subscribe if you haven't already, because stories like this matter. Stories of second chances and earned success and justice working itself out. Share this with someone who needs to hear that being underestimated is sometimes the greatest gift anyone can give you. Leave a comment telling me about your own journey back to yourself, your own story of rebuilding. And remember, when someone hands you divorce papers and says you're not good enough, sometimes the best response is to sign them without hesitation, because they're not ending your story. They're just getting out of the way so you can write the next chapter yourself. And that next chapter might be better than anything you imagined possible. Harold was right about everything. Character isn't revealed in success. It's revealed in how you treat people when you have nothing to gain from treating them well. Patricia and Nathan failed that test completely, spectacularly. I passed it without even trying, just by being decent and human. And in the end, that made all the difference. Not the money, not the power, not even the revenge, sweet as it was. Just the simple truth that I'd remained human when they'd chosen to be cruel. That was the real inheritance Harold left me. The knowledge that I had character, and no amount of money or status could create that in people who'd never developed it in the first place. That's something you either have or you don't, and I had it all along. I just needed someone to help me remember.